Heart of Ice. Once upon a time, there lived a king and queen who were foolish beyond all telling, but nevertheless, they were vastly fond of one another. It is true that certain spiteful people were heard to say that this was only one proof the more of their exceeding foolishness. But of course, you will understand that these were not their own courtiers, since after all, they were a king and queen. And up to this time, all things had prospered with them. For in those days, the one thing to be thought of in governing a kingdom was to keep well with all the fairies and enchanters, and on no account to stint them of the cakes, the yells of ribbon, and similar trifles which were their due. And above all things, when there was a christening, to remember to invite every single one, good, bad, or indifferent, to the ceremony. Now the foolish queen had one little son who was just going to be christened, and for several months she had been hard at work preparing an enormous list of the names of those who were to be invited. But she quite forgot that it would take nearly as long to read it over as it had taken to write it out. So when the moment of the christening arrived, the king, to whom the task had been entrusted, had barely reached the end of the second page, and his tongue was dripping with fatigue and haste as he repeated the usual formula. I conjure and pray you, fairy so-and-so, or enchanter such-a-one, to honor me with a visit and graciously bestow your gifts upon my son. To make matters worse, word was brought to him that the fairies asked on the first page had already arrived and were waiting impatiently in the court hall and grumbling that nobody was there to receive them. Thereupon, he gave up the list in despair and hurried to greet those whom he had succeeded in asking and imploring their goodwill so humbly that most of them were touched and promised that they would do his son no harm. But there happened to be among them a fairy from a far country about whom they knew nothing, though her name had been written on the first page of the list. This fairy was annoyed that after having taken the trouble to come so quickly, there had been no one to receive her or help her to alight from the great ostrich on which she had traveled from her distant home. And now she began to mutter to herself in the most alarming way. "Oh, prate away," she said. "Your son will never be anything to boast of. Say what you will, he will be nothing but a mannikin." No doubt she would have gone on longer in this strain and given the unhappy little prince half a dozen undesirable gifts if it had not been for the good fairy Ginesta, who held the kingdom under her special protection and who luckily hurried in just in time to prevent further mischief. When she had by compliment and entreaties pacified the unknown fairy and persuaded her to say no more, she gave the king a hint that now was the time to distribute the presents, after which ceremony they all took their departure, excepting the fairy Ginesta, who then went to see the queen and said to her, "A nice mess you seem to have made of this business, madam. Why did you not condescend to consult me? But foolish people like you always think they can do without help or advice. And I observe that in spite of all my goodness to you, you had not even the civility to invite me."
"Ah, dear madam," cried the king, throwing himself at her feet. "Did I ever have time to get as far as your name? See where I put in this mark when I abandoned the hopeless undertaking which I had but just begun?" "There, there," said the fairy. "I am not offended. I don't allow myself to be put out by trifles like that with people I really am fond of. But now about your son. I have saved him from a great many disagreeable things, but you must let me take him away and take care of him, and you will not see him again until he is all covered with fur." At these mysterious words, the king and queen burst into tears, for they lived in such a hot climate themselves that how or why the prince should come to be covered in fur they could not imagine, and thought it must portend some great misfortune to him. However, Janista told them not to disquiet themselves. "If I left him to you to bring up, you would be certain to make him as foolish as yourselves. I do not even intend to let him know that he is your son. As for you, you had better give your minds to governing your kingdom properly." So saying, she opened the window, and catching up the little prince, cradle and all, she glided away in the air as if she were skating upon ice. Leaving the king and queen in the greatest affliction, they consulted everyone who came near them as to what the fairy could possibly have meant by saying that when they saw their son again, he would be covered in fur. But nobody could offer any solution of the mystery, only they all seemed to agree that it must be something frightful. And the king and queen made themselves more miserable than ever, and wandered about their palace in a way to make anyone pity them. Meantime, the fairy had carried off the little prince to her own castle, and placed him under the care of a young peasant woman, whom she bewitched so as to make her think that this new baby was one of her own children. So the prince grew up healthy and strong, leading the simple life of a young peasant, for the fairy thought he could have no better training. Only, as he grew older, she kept him more and more with herself, that his mind might be cultivated and exercised, as well as his body. But her care did not cease there. She resolved that he should be tried by hardships and disappointments and the knowledge of his fellow men. For indeed, she knew the prince would need every advantage that she could give him, since, though he increased in years, he did not increase in height, but remained the tiniest of princes. However, in spite of this, he was exceedingly active and well-formed, and altogether so handsome and agreeable that the smallness of his stature was of no real consequence. The prince was perfectly aware that he was called by the ridiculous name of Mannikin, but he consoled himself by vowing that, happen what might, he would make it illustrative. In order to carry out her plans for his welfare, the fairy now began to send Prince Mannikin the most wonderful dreams of adventure by sea and land. And of these adventures, he himself was always the hero. Sometimes he rescued a lovely princess from some terrible danger. Again, he earned a kingdom by some brave deed, until at last he longed to go away and seek his fortune in a far country, where his humble birth would not prevent his gaining honor and riches by his courage. And it was with a heart full of ambitious projects that he rode one day into a great city not far from the fairy's castle. As he had set out intending to hunt in the surrounding forest, he was quite simply dressed and carried only a bow and arrows and a light spear. But even thus arrayed, he looked graceful and distinguished. As he entered the city, he saw that the inhabitants were all racing with one accord towards the marketplace. And he also turned his horse in the same direction, curious to know what was going forward. When he reached the spot, he found that certain foreigners of strange and outlandish appearance were about to make a proclamation to the assembled citizens. And he hastily pushed his way into the crowd until he was near enough to hear the words of the venerable old man who was their spokesman. "Let the whole world know that he who can reach the summit of the ice mountain shall receive as his reward not only the incomparable Sabella, fairest of the fair, but also all the realms of which she is queen." "Here," continued the old man after he had made this proclamation, "here is the list of all those princes who, struck by the beauty of the princess, have perished in the attempt to win her. And here is the list of these who have just entered upon the high emprise." Prince Mannikin was seized with a violent desire to inscribe his name among the others, but the remembrance of his dependent position and his lack of wealth held him back. But while he hesitated, the old man, with many respectful ceremonies, unveiled a portrait of the lovely Sabella, which was carried by some of the attendants, and after one glance at it, the prince delayed no longer, but rushing forward, demanded permission to add his name to the list. When they saw his tiny stature and simple attire, the strangers looked at each other doubtfully, not knowing whether to accept or refuse him. But the prince said haughtily, "Give me the paper that I may sign it," and they obeyed. What between admiration for the princess and annoyance at the hesitation shown by her ambassadors, the prince was too much agitated to choose any other name than the one by which he was always known. But when, after all the grand titles of the other princes, he simply wrote Mannikin, the ambassadors broke into shouts of laughter. "Miserable wretches," cried the prince, "but for the presence of that lovely portrait, I would cut off your heads." But he suddenly remembered that, after all, it was a funny name, and he had not yet had time to make it famous. So he was calm and inquired the way to the Princess Sabella's country. Though his heart did not fail him in the least, he still felt there were many difficulties before him, and he resolved to set out at once, without even taking leave of the fairy, for fear she might try to stop him. Everybody in the town who knew him made great fun of the idea of Mannikin's undertaking such an expedition, and it even came to the ears of the foolish king and queen, who laughed over it more than any of the others, without having an idea that the presumptuous mannequin was their only son. Meantime, the prince was traveling on, though the direction he had received for his journey were none of the clearest. 400 leagues north of Mount Caucasus, you will receive your orders and instructions for the conquest of the Ice Mountain. Fine marching orders, those for a man starting from a country near where Japan is nowadays. However, he fared eastward, avoiding all towns, lest the people should laugh at his name, for, you see, he was not a very experienced traveler and had not yet learned to enjoy a joke, even if it were against himself. At night, he slept in the woods, and at first he lived upon wild fruits, but the fairy, who was keeping a benevolent eye upon him, thought that it would never do to let him be half-starved in that way, and so she took to feeding him with all sorts of good things while he was asleep. And the prince wondered very much that when he was awake, he never felt hungry. True to her plan, the fairy sent him various adventures to prove his courage, and he came successfully through them all. Only in his last fight with a furious monster, rather like a tiger, he had the ill luck of losing his horse. However, nothing daunted, he struggled on foot, and at last reached a seaport. Here he found a boat sailing for the coast which he desired to reach, and having just enough money to pay his passage, he went on board and they started. But after some days, a fearful storm came on, which completely wrecked the little ship, and the prince only saved his life by swimming a long, long way to the only land that was in sight, and which proved to be a desert island. Here he lived by fishing and hunting, always hoping that the good fairy would presently rescue him. One day, as he was looking sadly out to sea, he became aware of a curious-looking boat which was drifting slowly towards the shore, and which presently ran into a little creek and there stuck fast in the sand. Prince Mannikin rushed down eagerly to examine it, and saw with amazement that the masts and spars were all branched and covered thickly with leaves until it looked like a little wood. Thinking from the stillness that there could be no one on board, the prince pushed aside the branches and sprang over the side, and found himself surrounded by the crew, who lay motionless as dead men and in a most deplorable condition. They, too, had become almost like trees and were growing to the deck or to the masts or to the sides of the vessel or to whatever they had happened to be touching when the enchantment fell upon them. Mannikin was struck with pity for their miserable plight, and set to work with might and main to release them. With the sharp point of one of his arrows, he gently detached their hands and feet from the wood, which held them fast, and carried them on shore, one after another, where he rubbed their rigid limbs and bathed them with infusions of various herbs with such success that after a few days they recovered perfectly, and were as fit to manage a boat as ever.
You may be sure that the good fairy Genesta had something to do with this marvelous cure, and she also put it into the prince's head to rub the boat itself with the same magic herbs which cleared it entirely, and not before it was time, for at the rate at which it was growing before, it would very soon have become a forest. The gratitude of the sailors was extreme,
and they willingly promised to land the prince on any coast he pleased. But when he questioned them about the extraordinary thing that had happened to them and to their ship, they could in no way explain it, except that they said that as they were passing along a thickly wooded coast, a sudden gust of wind had reached them from the land and enveloped them in a dense cloud of dust, after which everything in the boat that was not metal had sprouted and blossomed as the prince had seen, and that they themselves had grown gradually numb and heavy, and had finally lost all consciousness. Prince Mannikin was deeply interested in this curious story, and collected a quantity of the dust from the bottom of the boat which he carefully preserved, thinking that its strange property might one day stand him in good stead. Then they joyfully left the desert island, and after a long and prosperous voyage over calm seas, they at length came in sight of land, and resolved to go on shore, not only to take in a fresh stock of water and provisions, but also to find out, if possible, where they were and in what direction to proceed. As they neared the coast, they wondered if this could be another uninhabited land, for no human beings could be distinguished, and yet that something was stirring became evident. For in the dust clouds that moved near the ground, small, dark forms were dimly visible. These appeared to be assembling at the exact spot where they were preparing to run ashore. And what was their surprise to find they were nothing more nor less than large and beautiful spaniels, some mounted as sentries, others grouped in companies and regiments, all eagerly watching their disembarkation. When they found that Prince Mannikin, instead of saying, "Shoot them," as they had feared, said, "Hi, good dog," in a thoroughly friendly and ingratiating way, they crowded round him with a great wagging of tails and giving of paws, and very soon made him understand that they wanted him to leave his men with the boat and follow them. Prince Mannikin was so curious to know more about them that he agreed willingly. So, after arranging with the sailors to wait for him 15 days, and then, if he had not come back, to go on their way without him, he set out with his new friends. Their way lay inland, and Prince Mannikin noticed with great surprise that the fields were well cultivated, and that the carts and plows were drawn by horses or oxen, just as they might have been in any other country. And when they passed any village, the cottages were trim and pretty, and an air of prosperity was everywhere.
At one of the villages, a dainty little repast was set before the prince, and while he was eating, a chariot was brought, drawn by 2 splendid horses, which were driven with great skill by a large spaniel. In this carriage, he continued his journey very comfortably, passing many similar equipages upon the road, and being always most courteously saluted by the spaniels who occupied them. At last, they drove rapidly into a large town, which Prince Mannikin had no doubt was the capital of the kingdom. News of his approach had evidently been received, for all the inhabitants were at their doors and windows, and all the little spaniels
had climbed upon the wall and gates to see him arrive. The prince was delighted with the hearty welcome they gave him and looked round him with the deepest interest. After passing through a few wide streets, well paved and adorned with avenues of fine trees, they drove into the courtyard of a grand palace, which was full of spaniels who were evidently soldiers. The king's bodyguard, thought the prince to himself, as he returned their salutations, and then the carriage stopped, and he was shown into the presence of the king, who lay upon a rich Persian carpet, surrounded by several little spaniels, who were occupied in chasing away the flies, lest they should disturb his majesty. He was the most beautiful of all spaniels, with a look of sadness in his large eyes, which, however, quite disappeared as he sprang up to welcome Prince Mannikin with every demonstration of delight, after which he made a sign to his courtiers, who came one by one to pay their respects to the visitor. The prince thought that he would find himself puzzled as to how he should carry on a conversation, but as soon as he and the king were once more left alone, a secretary of state was sent for, who wrote from His Majesty's dictation a most polite speech, in which he regretted much that they were unable to converse except in writing, the language of dogs being difficult to understand. As for the writing, it had remained the same as the prince's own. Mannikin thereupon wrote a suitable reply, and then begged the king to satisfy his curiosity about all the strange things he had seen and heard since his landing. This appeared to awaken sad recollections in the king's mind, but he informed the prince that he was called King Bayard, and that a fairy, whose kingdom was next his own, had fallen violently in love with him, and had done all she could to persuade him to marry her, but that he could not do so, as he himself was the devoted lover of the Queen of the Spice Islands. Finally, the fairy, furious at the indifference with which her love was treated, had reduced him to the state in which the prince found him, leaving him unchanged in mind, but deprived of the power of speech, and, not content with wreaking her vengeance upon the king alone, she had condemned all her subjects to a similar fate, saying, "Bark and run upon 4 feet until the time comes when virtue shall be rewarded by love and fortune."
Which, as the poor king remarked, was very much the same thing as if she had said, "Remain a spaniel for ever and ever." Prince Mannikin was quite of the same opinion. Nevertheless, he said what we should all have said in the same circumstances. "Your Majesty must have patience." He was indeed deeply sorry for poor King Bayard, and said all the consoling things he could think of, promising to aid him with all his might if there was anything to be done. In short, they became firm friends, and the king
proudly displayed to Mannikin the portrait of the Queen of the Spice Islands, and he quite agreed that it was worthwhile to go through anything for the sake of a creature so lovely. Prince Mannikin, in his turn, told his own history and the great undertaking upon which he had set out, and King Bayard was able to give him some valuable instructions as to which would be the best way for him to proceed. And then they went together to the place where the boat had been left. The sailors were delighted to see the prince again, though they had known that he was safe. And when they had taken on board all the supplies which the king had sent for them, they started once more. The king and prince parted with much regret, and the former insisted that Mannikin should take with him one of his own pages named Masta, who was charged to attend to him everywhere and serve him faithfully, which he promised to do. The wind being favorable, they were soon out of hearing of the general howl of regret from the whole army, which had been given by order of the king as a great compliment. And it was not long before the land was entirely lost to view. They met with no further adventures worth speaking of, and presently found themselves within 2 leagues of the harbor for which they were making. The prince, however, thought it would suit him better to land where he was, so as to avoid the town, since he had no money left and was very doubtful as to what he should do next. So the sailors set him and Masta on shore, and then went back sorrowfully to their ship, while the prince and his attendant walked off in what looked to them the most promising direction. They soon reached a lovely green meadow on the border of a wood, which seemed to them so pleasant after their long voyage that they sat down to rest in the shade and amused themselves by watching the gambols and antics of a pretty tiny monkey in the trees close by. The prince presently became so fascinated by it that he sprang up and tried to catch it, but it eluded his grasp and kept just out of arm's reach until it had made him promise to follow wherever it led him. And then it sprang upon his shoulder and whispered in his ear, "We have no money, my poor Mannikin, and we are altogether badly off and at a loss to know what to do next." "Yes, indeed," answered the prince ruefully, "and I have nothing to give you, no sugar or biscuits or anything that you like, my pretty one."
"Since you are so thoughtful for me and so patient about your own affairs," said the little monkey, "I will show you the way to the Golden Rock. Only you must leave Musta to wait for you here." Prince Mannikin agreed willingly, and then the little monkey sprang from his shoulder to the nearest tree and began to run through the wood from branch to branch, crying, "Follow me." This the prince did not find quite so easy, but the little monkey waited for him and showed him the easiest places, until presently the wood grew thinner and they came out into a little clear, grassy space at the foot of a mountain, in the midst of which stood a single rock, about 10 feet high. When they were quite close to it, The little monkey said, "This stone looks pretty hard, but give it a blow with your spear and let us see what will happen." So the prince took his spear and gave the rock a vigorous dig, which split off several pieces and showed that though the surface was thinly coated with stone, inside it was one solid mass of pure gold. Thereupon the little monkey said, laughing at his astonishment, "I make you a present of what you have broken off. Take as much of it as you think proper." The prince thanked her gratefully and picked up one of the smallest of the lumps of gold. As he did so, the little monkey was suddenly transformed into a tall and gracious lady who said to him, "If you are always as kind and persevering and easily contented as you are now, you may hope to accomplish the most difficult tasks. Go on your way and have no fear that you will be troubled any more for lack of gold. For that little piece which you modestly chose shall never grow less. Use it as much as you will. But that you may see the danger you have escaped by your moderation, come with me." So saying, she led him back into the wood by a different path, and he saw that it was full of men and women. Their faces were pale and haggard, and they ran hither and thither, seeking madly upon the ground or in the air, starting at every sound, pushing and trampling upon one another in their frantic eagerness to find the way to the golden rock. "You see how they toil," said the fairy, "but it is all of no avail. They will end by dying of despair, as hundreds have done before them." As soon as they had gotten back to the place where they had left Musta, the fairy disappeared, and the prince and his faithful squire, who had greeted him with every demonstration of joy, took the nearest way to the city. Here they stayed several days, while the prince provided himself with horses and attendants, and made many inquiries about the Princess Sabella, and the way to her kingdom, which was still so far away that he could hear but little, and that of the vaguest description. But when he presently reached Mount Caucasus, it was quite a different matter. Here they seemed to talk of nothing but the Princess Sabella, and strangers from all parts of the world were traveling toward her father's court.
The prince heard plenty of assurances as to her beauty and her riches, but he also heard of the immense number of his rivals and their power. One brought an army at his back, another had vast treasures, a third was as handsome and accomplished as it was possible to be, while as to poor Mannikin, he had nothing but his determination to succeed, his faithful spaniel, and his ridiculous name, which last was hardly likely to help him. But as he could not alter it, he wisely determined not to think of it any more. After journeying for 2 whole months, they came at last to Trelinton, the capital of the Princess Sabella's kingdom, and here he heard dismal stories about the ice mountain, and how none of those who had attempted to climb it had ever come back. He heard also the story of King Fardakin-Braz, Sabella's father. It appeared that he,
being a rich and powerful monarch, had married a lovely princess named Bourboniton, and they were as happy as the day was long. So happy that as they were out sledging one day, they were foolish enough to defy fate to spoil their happiness. "We shall see about that," grumbled an old hag who sat by the wayside, blowing her fingers to keep them warm. The king thereupon was very angry and wanted to punish the woman, but the queen prevented him, saying, "Alas, sire, do not let us make bad worse. No doubt this is a fairy." "You are right there," said the old woman, and immediately she stood up, and as they gazed at her in horror, she grew gigantic and terrible. Her staff turned to a fiery dragon with outstretched wings, her ragged cloak to a golden mantle, and her wooden shoes to 2 bundles of rockets. "You are right there, and you will see what will come of your fine goings-on, and remember the fairy Gorgonzola." So saying, she mounted the dragon and flew straight away to the North Pole, where she shut up her stolen treasure on the summit of the ice mountain, and surrounded it with so many difficulties that she felt quite easy about its remaining there as long as the princess lived. And then she went home, chuckling at her success.
As to the other fairies, they went home after the banquet without discovering that anything was amiss, and so the king and queen were quite happy. Sabella grew prettier day by day. She learnt everything a princess ought to know without the slightest trouble. And yet something always seemed lacking to make her perfectly charming. She had an exquisite voice, but whether her songs were grave or gay, it did not matter. She did not know what they meant, and everyone who heard her said, "She certainly sings perfectly, but there is no tenderness, no heart in her voice." Poor Sabella! How could there be when her heart was far away on the ice mountains? And it was just the same with all the other things that she did. As time went on, in spite of the admiration of the whole court and the blind fondness of the king and queen, it became more and more evident that something was fatally wrong. For those who love no one cannot long be loved. And at last, the king called a general assembly and invited the fairies to attend, that they might, if possible, find out what was the matter. After explaining their grief as well as he could, he ended by begging them to see the princess for themselves. "It is certain," said he, "that something is wrong. What it is, I don't know how to tell you, but in some way your work is imperfect." They all assured him that so far as they knew, everything had been done for the princess, and they had forgotten nothing that they could bestow on so good a neighbor as the king had been to them. After this, they went to see Sabella, but they had no sooner entered her presence than they cried out with one accord, "Oh, horror! She has no heart!" On hearing this frightful announcement, the king and queen gave a cry of despair and entreated the fairies to find some remedy for such an unheard-of misfortune. Thereupon the eldest fairy consulted her book of magic, which she always carried about with her,
hung to her girdle by a thick silver chain, and there she found out at once that it was Gorgonzola who had stolen the princess's heart, and also discovered what the wicked old fairy had done with it. "What shall we do? What shall we do?" cried the king and queen in one breath. "You must certainly suffer much annoyance from seeing and loving Sabella, who is nothing but a beautiful image. And this must go on for a long time. But I think I see that in the end, she will once more regain her heart. My advice is that you shall at once cause her portrait to be sent all over the world, and promise her hand and all her possessions to the prince who is successful in reaching her heart. Her beauty alone is sufficient to engage all the princes of the world in the quest." This was accordingly done, and Prince Mannikin heard that already 500 princes had perished in the snow and ice, not to mention their squires and pages, and that more continued to arrive daily, eager to try their fortune.
After some consideration, he determined to present himself at court. But his arrival made no stir, as his retinue was as inconsiderable as his stature, and the splendor of his rivals was great enough to throw even Fardakinbras himself into the shade. However, he paid his respects to the king very gracefully, and asked permission to kiss the hand of the princess in the usual manner. But when he said he was called Mannikin, the king could hardly repress a smile, and the princes who stood by openly shouted with laughter. Turning to the king, Prince Mannikin said with great dignity, "Pray laugh if it pleases your majesty. I'm glad that it is in my power to afford you any amusement. But I am not a plaything for these gentlemen, and I must beg them to dismiss any ideas of that kind from their minds at once." And with that he turned upon the one who had laughed the loudest and proudly challenged him to a single combat. This prince, who was called Fodas, accepted the challenge very scornfully, mocking at Mannikin, whom he felt sure had no chance against himself. But the meeting was arranged for the next day. When Prince Mannikin quitted the king's presence, he was conducted to the audience hall of Princess Sabella. The sight of so much beauty and magnificence almost took his breath away for an instant. But recovering himself with an effort, he said, "Lovely princess, irresistibly drawn by the beauty of your portrait, I come from the other end of the world to offer my services to you. My devotion knows no bounds, but my absurd name has already involved me in a quarrel with one of your courtiers. Tomorrow I am to fight this ugly, overgrown prince, and I beg you to honor the combat with your presence and prove to the world that 4 is nothing in a name, and that you deign to accept Mannikin as your knight." When it came to this, the princess could not help being amused, for though she had no heart, she was not without humor. However, she answered graciously that she accepted with pleasure, which encouraged the prince to entreat further that she would show no favor to his adversary. "Alas," said she,
I favor none of these foolish people who weary me with their sentiment and their folly. I do very wet as I am, and yet from one year's end to another, they talk of nothing but delivering me from some imaginary affliction. Not a word do I understand of all their prattings about love, and who knows what dull things besides, which I declare to you I cannot even remember. Mannikin was quick enough to gather from this speech that to amuse and interest the princess would be a far surer way of gaining her favor than to add himself to the list of those who continuously teased her about that mysterious thing called love, which she was so incapable of comprehending. So he began to talk about his rivals and found in each of them something to make merry over, in which diversion the princess joined him heartily. And so well did he succeed in his attempt to amuse her that before very long she declared that of all the people at court, he was the one to whom she preferred to talk.
The day following, at the time appointed for the combat, when the king, the queen, and the princess had taken their places, and the whole court and the whole town were assembled to see the show, Prince Fadas rode into the lists magnificently armed and accoutred, followed by 24 squires and 100 men at arms, each one leading a splendid horse, while Prince Mannikin entered from the other side, armed only with his spear, and followed by the faithful Musta. The contrast between the two champions was so great that there was a shout of laughter from the whole assembly. But when, at the sounding of a trumpet, the combatants rushed upon each other, and Mannikin, eluding the blow aimed at him, succeeded in thrusting Prince Fadas from his horse and pinning him to the sand with his spear, it changed to a murmur of admiration. So soon as he had him at his mercy, however, Mannikin, turning to the princess, assured her that he had no desire to kill anyone who called himself her courtier. And then he bade the furious and humiliated Fadas rise and thank the princess to whom he owed his life. Then, amid the sounding of the trumpets and shoutings of the people, he and Musta retired gravely from the lists. The king soon sent for him to congratulate him upon his success and to offer him a lodging in the palace, which he joyfully accepted, while the princess expressed a wish to have Musta brought to her. And when the prince sent for him, she was so delighted with his courtly manners and his marvelous intelligence that she entreated Mannikin to give him to her for her own. The prince consented with alacrity, not only out of politeness, but because he foresaw that to have a faithful friend always near the princess might someday be of great service to him. All these events made Prince Mannikin a person of much more consequence at the court. Very soon after, there arrived upon the frontier the ambassador of a very powerful king, who sent to Farda-Kinbras the following letter, at the same time demanding permission to enter the capital in state to receive the answer. Quote, I, Branda Timor, to Farda-Kinbras in greeting. If I had before this time seen the portrait of your beautiful daughter Sabella,
I should not have permitted all these adventurers and petty princes to be dancing attendants and getting themselves frozen with the absurd idea of meriting her hand. For myself, I am not afraid of any rivals, and now I have declared my intention of marrying your daughter. No doubt they will at once withdraw their pretensions. My ambassador has orders, therefore, to make arrangements for the princess to come and be married to me without delay, for I attach no importance at all to the farrago of nonsense which you have caused to be published all over the world about this ice mountain. If the princess really has no heart, be assured that I shall not concern myself about it, since if anybody can help her to discover one, it is myself. My worthy father-in-law, farewell." Unquote.
The reading of this letter embarrassed and displeased Far de Cambras and Bourbantine immensely, while the princess was furious at the insolence of the demand. They all three resolved that its contents must be kept a profound secret until they could decide what reply should be sent. But Mostaa contrived to send word of all that had passed to Prince Mannikin. He was naturally alarmed and indignant, and after thinking it over a little, he begged an audience of the princess and led the conversation so cunningly up to the subject that was uppermost in her thoughts, as well as his own, that she presently told him all about the matter and asked his advice as to what it would be best to do. This was exactly what he had not been able to decide for himself. However, he replied that he should advise her to gain a little time by promising her answer after the grand entry of the ambassador, and this was accordingly done. The ambassador did not at all like being put off after that fashion, but he was obliged to be content, and only said very arrogantly that so soon as his equipages arrived, as he expected they would do very shortly, he would give all the people of the city and the stranger princes with whom it was inundated an ideal of the power and the magnificence of his master. Mannikin, in despair, resolved that he would for once beg the assistance of the kind fairy Genesta. He often thought of her, and always with gratitude, but from the moment of his setting out, he had determined to seek her aid only on the greatest occasions. That very night, when he had fallen asleep quite worn out from thinking over all the difficulties of the situation, he dreamed that the fairy stood beside him and said, "Mannikin, you have done very well so far. Continue to please me, and you shall always find good friends when you need them most. As for this affair with the ambassador, you can assure Sabella that she may look forward tranquilly to his triumphal entry, since it will all turn out well for her in the end." The prince tried to throw himself at her feet to thank her, but woke to find it was all a dream. Nevertheless, he took fresh courage and went next day to see the princess, to whom he gave many mysterious assurances that all would yet be well. He even went so far as to ask her if she would not be very grateful to anyone who would rid her of the insolent Brandatimor, to which she replied that her gratitude would know bounds.
Then he wanted to know what her best wish for the person who was lucky enough to accomplish it, to which she said that she would wish them to be as insensible to the folly called love as she was herself. This was indeed a crushing speech to make to such a devoted lover as Prince Mannikin, but he concealed the pain it caused him with great courage.
And now the ambassador sent to say that on the very next day he would come in state to receive his answer. And from the earliest dawn, the inhabitants were astir to secure the best places for the grand sight. But the good fairy Janista was providing them an amount of amusement they were far from expecting, for she so enchanted the eye of all the spectators that when the ambassador's gorgeous procession appeared, the splendid uniforms seemed to them miserable rags that a beggar would have been ashamed to wear. The prancing horses appeared as wretched skeletons, hardly able to drag one leg after the other, while their trappings, which really sparkled with gold and jewels, looked like old sheepskins that would not have been good enough for a plow horse. The pages resembled the ugliest sweeps. The trumpets gave no more sound than whistles made of onion stalks or combs wrapped in paper, while the train of 50 carriages looked no better than 50 donkey carts. And in the last of these sat the ambassador, with the haughty and scornful air which he considered becoming and the representative of so powerful a monarch. For this was the crowning point of the absurdity of the whole procession, that all who took part in it wore the expression of vanity and self-satisfaction and pride in their own appearance and all their surroundings, which they believed their splendor amply justified. The laughter and howls of derision from the whole crowd rose ever louder and louder as the extraordinary cortege advanced, and at last reached the ears of the king as he waited in the audience hall. And before the procession reached the palace, he had been informed of its nature, and supposing that it must be intended as an insult, he ordered the gates to be closed. You may imagine the fury of the ambassador when, after all his pomp and pride, the king absolutely and unaccountably refused to receive him. He raved wildly both at king and people, and the cortege retired in great confusion, jeered at and pelted with stones and mud by the enraged crowd. It is needless to say that he left the country as fast as horses could carry him, but not before he had declared war with the most terrible menaces, threatening to devastate the country with fire and sword. Some days after this disastrous embassy, King Bay sent couriers to Prince Mannikin with the most friendly letter, offering his services in any difficulty, and inquiring with the deepest interest how he fared. Mannikin at once replied, relating all that had happened since they parted, not forgetting to mention the event which had just involved Far to seek and bring him back in this deadly quarrel.
and he ended by entreating his faithful friend to dispatch a few thousands of his veteran spaniels to his assistance.
Neither the king, the queen, nor the princess could in the least understand the amazing conduct of Brandatimor's ambassador. Nevertheless, the preparations for the war went forward briskly, and all the princes who had not gone on towards the ice mountain offered their services, at the same time demanding all the best appointments in the king's army. Mannikin was one of the first to volunteer, but he only asked to go as aide-de-camp to the commander-in-chief, who was a gallant soldier and celebrated for his victories. As soon as the army could be got together, it was marched to the frontier, where it met the opposing force headed by Brandatimor himself, who was full of fury, determined to avenge the insult to his ambassador and to possess himself of the Princess Sabella. All the army of Vardakenbra could do, being so heavily outnumbered, was to act upon the defensive. And before long, Mannikin won the esteem of the officers for his ability and of the soldiers for his courage and care for their welfare. And in all the skirmishes which he conducted, he had the good fortune to vanquish the enemy. At last, Brandatimor engaged the whole army in a terrific conflict, and though the troops of Vardakenbra fought with desperate courage, their general was killed, and they were defeated and forced to retreat with immense loss. Mannikin did wonders, and 6 times turned the retreating forces and beat back the enemy. And he afterwards collected troops enough to keep them in check, until the severe winter setting in put an end to hostilities for a while. He then returned to the court, where consternation reigned. The king was in despair at the death of his trusty general, and ended by imploring Mannikin to take the command of the army, and his counsel was followed in all the affairs of the court. He followed up his former plan of amusing the princess, and on no account reminding her of that tedious thing called love, so that she was always glad to see him, and the winter slipped by gaily for both of them. The prince was all the while secretly making plans for the next campaign. He received private intelligence of the arrival of a strong reinforcement of spaniels, to whom he sent orders to post themselves along the frontier without attracting attention. And as soon as he possibly could, he held a consultation with their commander, who was an old and experienced warrior. Following his advice, he decided to have a pitched battle as soon as the enemy advanced, and this Brandatimor lost not a moment in, as he was perfectly persuaded that he was now going to make an end of the war and utterly vanquished Vardakenbra. But no sooner had he given the order to charge than the spaniels, who had mingled with his troops unperceived, leaped each upon the horse nearest to him and not only threw the whole squadron into confusion by the terror they caused, but, springing at the throats of the riders, unhorsed many of them by the suddenness of their attack. Then, turning the horses to the rear, they spread consternation everywhere and made it easy for Prince Mannikin to gain a complete victory. He met Branditamor in single combat and succeeded in taking him prisoner. But he did not live to reach the court to which Mannikin had sent him. His pride killed him at the thought of appearing before Sabella under these altered circumstances. In the meantime, Prince Vadas and all the others who had remained behind were setting out with all speed for the conquest of the ice mountain, being afraid that Prince Mannikin might prove as successful in that as he seemed to be in everything else. And when Mannikin returned, he heard of it with great annoyance. True, he had been serving the princess, but she only admired and praised him for his gallant deeds, and seemed no whit nearer bestowing on him the love he so ardently desired. And all the comfort Musta could give him on the subject was that at least she loved no one else, and with that he had to content himself. But he determined that come what might, he would delay no longer, but attempt the great undertaking for which he had come so far. When he went to take leave of the king and queen, they entreated him not to go, as they had just heard that Prince Vadas and all who accompanied him had perished in the snow. But he persisted in his resolve. As for Sabella, she gave her hand to kiss with precisely the same gracious indifference as she had given it to him the first time they met. It happened that this farewell took place before the whole court, and so great a favorite had Prince Mannikin become that they were all indignant at the coldness with which the princess treated him. Finally, the king said to him, "Prince, you have constantly revealed all the gifts which, in my gratitude for your invaluable services, I have offered to you. But I wish the princess to present you with her cloak of marten's fur, and that I hope you will not reject." Now this was a splendid fur mantle which the princess was very fond of wearing, not so much because she felt cold, as that its richness set off to perfection the delicate tints of her complexion and the brilliant gold of her hair. However, she took it off, and with graceful politeness begged Prince Mannikin to accept it, which you may be sure he was charmed to do, and taking only this and a little bundle of all kinds of wood, and accompanied only by 2 spaniels out of the 50 who had stayed with him when the war was ended, he set forth, receiving many tokens of love and favor from the people in every town he passed through.
At the last little village, he left his horse behind him to begin his toilful march through the snow, which extended blank and terrible in every direction as far as the eye could see. Here he had appointed to meet the other 48 spaniels, who received him joyfully and assured him that happen what might, they would follow and serve him faithfully. And so they started, full of heart and hope. At first, there was a slight track, difficult but not impossible to follow. But this was soon lost,
and the pole star was their only guide. When the time came to call a halt, the prince, who had after much consideration decided on his plan of action, caused a few twigs from the faggot he had brought with him to be planted in the snow, and then he sprinkled over them a pinch of magic powder he had collected from the enchanted boat. To his great joy, they instantly began to sprout and grow. And in a marvelously short time, the camp was surrounded by a perfect grove of trees of all sorts, which blossomed and bore ripe fruit, so that all their wants were easily supplied, and they were able to make huge fires to warm themselves. The prince then sent out several spaniels to reconnoiter, and they had the good luck to discover a horse laden with provisions stuck fast in the snow. They at once fetched their comrades and brought the spoil triumphantly into the camp. And as it consisted principally of biscuits, not a spaniel among them went supperless to sleep. In this way, they journeyed by day and encamped safely at night, always remembering to take on a few branches to provide them with food and shelter. They passed by the way armies of those who had set out upon the perilous enterprise, who stood frozen stiffly, without sense or motion. But Prince Mannikin strictly forbade that any attempt should be made to thaw them. So they went on and on for more than 3 months, and day by day the ice mountain, which they had seen for a long time, grew clearer, until at last they stood close to it and shuddered at its height and steepness. But by patience and perseverance they crept up foot by foot, aided by their fires of magic wood, without which they must have perished in the intense cold, until presently they stood at the gates of the magnificent ice palace which crowned the mountain, where, in deadly silence and icy sleep, lay the heart of Sabella.
Now the difficulty became immense, for if they maintained enough heat to keep themselves alive, they were in danger every moment of melting the blocks of solid ice of which the palace was entirely built, and bringing the whole structure down upon their heads. But cautiously and quickly they traversed courtyards and halls until they found themselves at the foot of a vast throne, where, upon a cushion of snow, lay an enormous and brilliantly sparkling diamond, which contained the heart of the lovely Princess Sabella. Upon the lowest step of the throne was inscribed in icy letters, "Whosoever thou art, who by courage and virtue canst win the heart of Sabella, enjoy peacefully the good fortune which thou hast richly deserved." Prince Mannikin bounded forward and had just strength left to grasp the precious diamond which contained all he coveted in the world before he fell insensible upon the snowy cushion. But his good spaniels lost no time in rushing to the rescue,
and between them they bore him hastily from the hall, and not a moment too soon, for all around them they heard the clang of the falling blocks of ice as the fairy palace slowly collapsed under the unwanted heat. Not until they reached the foot of the mountain did they pause to restore the prince to consciousness, and then his joy to find himself the possessor of Sabella's heart knew no bounds. With all speed they began to retrace their steps, but this time the happy prince could not bear the sight of his defeated and disappointed rivals, whose frozen forms lined his triumphant way. He gave orders to his spaniels to spare no pains to restore them to life, and so successful were they that day by day his train increased, so that by the time he got back to the little village where he had left his horse, he was escorted by 500 sovereign princes and knights and squires without number. And he was so courteous and unassuming that they all followed him willingly, anxious to do him honor. But then he was so happy and blissful himself that he found it easy to be at peace with all the world. It was not long before he met the faithful Musta, who was coming at the top of his speed, hoping to meet the prince, that he might tell him of the sudden and wonderful change that had come over the princess, who had become gentle and thoughtful, and had talked to him of nothing but Prince Mannikin, of the hardships she feared he might be suffering, and of her anxiety for him. And all this with 100 fonder expressions, which put the finishing stroke to the prince's delight. Then came a courier bearing the congratulations of the king and queen, who had just heard of his successful return. And there was even a graceful compliment from Sabella herself. The prince sent Musta back to her, and he was welcomed with joy, for was he not her lover's present?
At last the travelers reached the capital and were received with regal magnificence. Farder-Kinbras and Bourbon-Tine embraced Prince Mannikin, declaring that they regarded him as their heir and the future husband of the princess. To which he replied that they did him too much honor. And then he was admitted into the presence of the princess, who for the first time in her life blushed as he kissed her hand and could not find a word to say. But the prince, throwing himself on his knees beside her, held out the splendid diamond, saying, "Madam, this treasure is yours, since none of the dangers and difficulties I have gone through have been sufficient to make me deserve it." "Ah, Prince," said she, "if I take it, it is only that I may give it back to you, since truly it belongs to you already." At this moment, in came the king and queen and interrupted them by asking all the questions imaginable, and not infrequently the same over and over again. It seems that there is always one thing that is sure to be said about an event by everybody, and Prince Mannikin found that the question which he was asked by more than 1,000 people on this particular occasion was, "And didn't you find it very cold?" The king had come to request Prince Mannikin and the princess to follow him to the council chamber, which they did.
not knowing that he meant to present the prince to all the nobles assembled there as his son-in-law and successor. But when Mannikin perceived his intention, he begged permission to speak first and told his whole story, even to the fact that he believed himself to be a peasant's son. Scarcely had he finished speaking when the sky grew black. The thunder growled and the lightning flashed, and in the blaze of light, the good fairy Genesta suddenly appeared. Turning to Prince Mannikin, she said, "I am satisfied with you, since you have shown not only courage, but a good heart." Then she addressed King Farda Kinbras and informed him of the real history of the prince and how she had determined to give him the education she knew would be best for a man who was to command others. "You have already found the advantage of having a faithful friend, and now you will have the pleasure of seeing King Bayard and his subjects regain their natural forms as a reward for his kindness to you."
Just then arrived a chariot drawn by eagles, which proved to contain the foolish king and queen, who embraced their long-lost son with great joy, and were greatly struck with the fact that they did indeed find him covered with fur. While they were caressing Sabella and wringing her hands, which is a favorite form of endearment with foolish people, chariots were seen approaching from all points of the compass, containing numbers of fairies. "Sire," said Genesta to Farda Kinbras, "I have taken the liberty of appointing your court as a meeting place for all the fairies who could spare the time to come, and I hope you can arrange to hold the great ball which we have once in 100 years on this occasion." The king, having suitably acknowledged the honor done him, was next reconciled to Gorgonzola, and they two presently opened the ball together. The fairy Maracentine restored their natural forms to King Bayard and all his subjects, and he appeared once more as handsome a king as you could wish to see. One of the fairies immediately dispatched her chariot for the Queen of the Spice Islands, and their wedding took place at the same time as that of the Prince Mannikin and the lovely and gracious Sabella. They lived happily ever afterwards, and their vast kingdoms were presently divided between their children. The prince, out of grateful remembrance of the Princess Sabella's first gift to him, bestowed the right of bearing her name upon the most beautiful of the martins, and that is why they are called sables to this day.